You smell rot beneath the sandalwood. Not the rot of death, death would be honest, but the rot of memory, sealed behind painted doors and perfumed fabric. You are walking, but no footsteps echo. The floors here are trained not to speak. Like the women. Like the boys. Like the rooms. Silk brushes your skin, too soft, too thin. It clings like obligation. The light doesn't reach you here. The lanterns are dimmed on purpose. Gold leaf on the walls peels like skin. Somewhere behind you, a door closes with no sound. You do not turn around. Ahead, a curtain stirs without wind. The air is heavy with old incense, but it can't hide the truth. Not completely. It lingers, metallic, humid, alive. It's the scent of flesh that was touched too many times. Of breath that was taken and never returned. Of secrets soaked into silk and then rinsed clean for the next girl. You pass mirrors that reflect nothing. Portraits where the eyes have been scratched out. Pillows dented in the shapes of people who were never allowed to sleep. No one speaks. No one cries. In this place, grief is not permitted. Not even in silence. You want to look away. But you can't. Because behind every veil is a story no one recorded. A body that history decided was unimportant. A scream that never reached the ears of the gods. This is the hidden corridor between the throne and the bed. Between empire and body. Between legacy and violation. And you are not supposed to be here. They won't tell you about this room. They'll show you the dragon throne, the calligraphy, the jade collections. They'll recite poetry and honor rituals. But they will not mention the girl taken at 9. The eunuch who bled into his own hands. The concubine who gave birth only to bury her child before sunrise. They will not speak of the night rituals. Or the inspections. Or the moment a girl learned that obedience was the only way to survive. History was not written by the victors. It was written by the survivors. But only those whose stories were allowed to live. And these stories were not. They were buried beneath dynasty and incense, beneath the silk scrolls and the silence. Hidden behind walls that still stand, even now, polished clean for tourists who don't ask the right questions. But you just opened the wrong door. And now you're inside. This is the part of history you were never meant to see. And you have to ask yourself, if it was this well hidden. What else did they erase? If you think history class failed you, hit subscribe. And if you won't, then at least explain why in the comments. Someone needs to answer for this silence. The door shuts behind you. No lock clicks, but you feel the finality of it in your spine. You've crossed a threshold now, into something older than rules, older than memory. This is the kneading, the inner court. The place emperors ruled with their hands, not their decrees. And once inside, no one belonged to themselves again. The dynasties changed their names, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, but the walls remained the same. Stone for the outside world. Silk for the inside. Time passed in seasons of silence. New emperors rose, old ones were buried in gold, but the structure never changed. It wasn't built for love. Or even lust. It was built for control. The Forbidden City was not just a palace. It was a labyrinth of rituals, a machine powered by obedience, beauty, and fear. And at its heart, locked away from the gaze of the world, was the harem, the women's quarters. Not for their protection. But for the emperor's pleasure. Here, women did not come and go. They were sentenced. Some were chosen at birth, their fates sealed by astrologers and family greed. Others were captured, gifted, traded like coins between provinces, paraded before eunuchs like livestock. Their names were written down, but not remembered. Only the emperor's memory mattered. He decided who would rise. Who would bleed? Who would carry a son? And who would disappear? They were called concubines, but their titles were dressed in poetry. Fragrant consort. Pure one. Lady of grace. But no name, however beautiful, could mask what this was: imprisonment, wrapped in silk and protocol. Thousands of women, confined to courtyards behind high walls. Watched day and night. Taught not to speak unless spoken to. Taught to walk without sound, to breathe without want, to exist without needing. They were schooled in music, poetry, calligraphy, not for themselves, but to entertain the man who owned their futures. Some saw the emperor once. Some never saw him at all. And some became his favorite, until they aged out of beauty and into invisibility. And when they did, they weren't dismissed. They were moved. To smaller rooms. Darker corridors. Further from the sunlight. Out of sight. Out of Dynasty. There were rules. Hundreds of them. How to bathe. How to present food. How to kneel. How to cry. How to survive. There were rules for smiling. Rules for aging. Rules for dying. But no rules for leaving. Because no one left the inner court. Not alive. Not whole. Not remembered. This was not a sanctuary. It was a warehouse of beauty. A storeroom of human offerings. And the emperor? He was not a man inside these walls. He was a god. Which made every girl a sacrifice. You walk past rows of windows with no view. Courtyards with no sound. Women practicing smiles in polished bronze mirrors. Waiting. Always waiting. For a glance. For a summons. For a way out. But there is no door in this palace that opens from the inside. If you feel a weight pressing on your chest, know that it's real. That weight has names. Thousands of them. Hidden in old archives, burned in dynastic fires, buried beneath stone and ash. But you can still feel them. Still hear them. And if you believe their names deserve more than dust, then subscribe to this channel, Tale of History. And if you won't, then tell us why in the comments. Not for us. But for the girls who never had a voice. The emperor did not knock when he entered a room. He didn't have to. He was the center of the known world, the son of heaven, the divine tether between earth and sky. To speak his name was to risk offending the cosmos. To refuse his touch was to defy fate. And to love him? That was never part of the bargain. He did not belong to the women of the harem. They belonged to him. He saw them as one might see a garden, rows of cultivated beauty arranged by season, age, and purpose. Their fates hung on a single glance. A lifted eyebrow. A remembered name. But not all women were equal inside the forbidden city. The harem was a kingdom within a kingdom, governed by its own brutal hierarchy. And at the very top, the few concubines who had tasted favor. They were elevated. Given jewels, better quarters, sweeter rice. But their reward came with its own curse, proximity. The closer they got to power, the more they were watched. Every gesture, every breath, every word became a gamble. Below them, the others waited in silence, unseen, untouched, unchosen. Some had been there for decades. Still young when they arrived. Still waiting for a door that never opened. They were the forgotten. Decorations for a throne that had long since lost interest. The court had a word for those who remained too long, dead flowers. But before any girl was summoned, before she crossed the threshold of the imperial bedchamber, her body was no longer hers. She belonged first to the eunuchs, the emperor's silent priests of intimacy. They were not whole. Not by choice. Boys taken at 10 or 11. Castrated with dull knives or broken glass. Some survived. Many didn't. Those who lived became servants of the emperor's most private whims. They bathed the concubines, inspected them, watched over their purity like temple guards guarding a shrine. But this shrine breathed. It wept. It trembled. Before each encounter, the chosen girl was stripped, examined, perfumed. She was soaked in flower water, scraped clean with ivory tools, checked for disease, bruises, and blemishes. No scar could be hidden. No imperfection forgiven. Her breath was checked. Her hair was combed until it shined like lacquered wood. Her pulse, measured. Not by a physician, but by tradition. She was not being prepared for pleasure. She was being prepared for presentation. She was not expected to speak. Or move. Or resist. Only to please. Quietly. Without memory. Without need. Because this was never about desire. It was about power. The emperor didn't need love, he required obedience. And the eunuchs ensured he received it. Some of them wept in private. Others became cruel, mimicking the same rituals that had once broken them. But all of them shared a truth too dangerous to voice: they were the only men in a palace full of women, and yet, not men at all. They held the keys to the emperor's appetite. They enforced silence. They erased resistance. And in doing so, they became both victims and accomplices. Both gatekeepers, and ghosts. If this feels more like psychological warfare than romance, you're not alone. Subscribe so the truth doesn't stay buried beneath silk and incense. And if you're still hesitating, tell us why in the comments. We're listening. It always began with a whisper. A rumor drifting through the courtyards like smoke, curling under doors, slipping through rice paper screens. A eunuch's gaze that lingered half a second too long. A sudden request for a girl to prepare her finest robe. An unspoken terror settling in her gut long before the order was ever spoken aloud. You have been chosen. The words were meant to sound like honor. But everyone knew what they meant. The other girls turned their eyes away, not out of jealousy, but out of relief that it wasn't them. Not tonight. No one asked if she wanted to go. Wanting had no place in the harem. The emperor's desires were divine. And divinity did not negotiate. Sometimes, the girl was 14. Sometimes 12. Sometimes younger. She was taken from a province her parents would never hear from again. A poor family offered her up to curry favor, or settle a tax debt, or please a visiting court official. And once inside the walls of the forbidden city, her past no longer mattered. Her name might survive on a scroll, but her voice, her will, her sense of self were dissolved in rituals older than her bloodline. The preparation began at dusk. She was bathed in silence, surrounded by eunuchs and older concubines who had done this too many times to cry anymore. Her skin scrubbed raw with salt and flower oil. Hair perfumed with jasmine or orchid, depending on the season. Fingernails filed to perfect half-moons. No part of her left untouched. No blemish allowed to survive the ritual. Some girls were trembling. Some were drugged. A few whispered prayers no one dared answer. She would be dressed in red, the color of luck. But she knew luck had nothing to do with what would happen next. Before entering the imperial bedchamber, she was inspected one final time. A eunuch would run his eyes over her like an appraiser inspecting an artifact. Her silence was mandatory. Her shame, irrelevant. Then came the proof. For girls whose virginity had not yet been claimed, a ceremonial cloth was prepared. White silk. Impossibly soft. Impossibly cruel. It was placed beneath her as she lay still, unblinking, listening to the sound of her own breath crack and shudder in the candlelight. And afterward, if blood appeared, if the cloth bore the stain of what had been taken, then the ritual was deemed complete. The cloth was folded. Preserved. A record of obedience. But if it didn't? If the emperor suspected deceit, or if her body simply refused to behave as expected? The punishment came swiftly. Some were beaten. Others demoted to the lowest ranks, made to sweep the corridors of women more favored than they. And some, quietly, discreetly, disappeared. Because a girl who failed the emperor was not just a disappointment. She was a threat to order. An insult to the throne. A reminder that even gods can be refused. And gods do not tolerate reminders. The morning after was no softer. If she had pleased him, she might be summoned again. Perhaps even granted a better chamber, more delicate food, a servant of her own. But if not, if her eyes had lingered too long, if her hands had trembled, if her silence was not perfectly timed, she was forgotten. Not punished. Not exiled. Just, moved. To a smaller room. Further from the sun. And there, she would wait again. Weeks. Months. Years. Until someone else forgot she was ever chosen at all. This was the ritual. This was the nightmare disguised as duty. A selection that never meant freedom, only a different kind of cage. And in all those years of silence, no one asked her how it felt. No one recorded her thoughts. No one wrote her story. She existed only in the folds of red silk. In a stain no one wanted to remember. In a palace that called her fortunate while slowly erasing her name. If you feel a knot in your chest, if your breath caught somewhere between horror and grief, you're not alone. Subscribe so these girls are not forgotten again. And if you still don't think this story needs remembering, tell us why in the comments. We're listening. Even if no one else ever did. The scrolls were never meant to be read by common eyes. Bound in silk, inked with calligraphy so delicate it seemed like art, they looked harmless, ornamental, even. But the words written inside were not poems. They were instructions. Coded rituals passed between emperors like sacred inheritance, dictating how power was to be performed not in court, but in bed. In the Ming Dynasty, these scrolls multiplied. Scholars called them manuals. Physicians called them prescriptions. But what they truly were scripts, detailed outlines of how the emperor was to dominate the female body, not just for pleasure, but for immortality. According to Taoist belief, the emperor's body was a vessel of cosmic energy. To age was to decay. To decay was to fall. And so, to preserve the throne, he had to preserve himself. The solution? Not medicine. Not rest. But ritualized intercourse with virgins. It was believed that a young girl's life force, her jing, her essence, could be drawn into the emperor through sex. But not just any sex. The scrolls dictated precise techniques, rhythm, breath control, positioning, and most disturbingly, restraint. The emperor was to remain detached. Cold. Godlike. The girl was to remain still. Completely. No moans. No movement. No eye contact. Emotion was considered pollution. Pleasure, a distraction. The ideal concubine was a silent vessel, emptied of self, purified through obedience, preserved through stillness. If she trembled, she was weak. If she cried, she was unworthy. So they were trained. Not in affection, but in erasure. Older concubines, eunuchs, and chamber women instructed the new arrivals. They were taught how to breathe without sound. How to arch without initiative. How to bear discomfort without flinching. How to vanish behind their own faces. Because the emperor did not want to see the girl. He wanted to see power reflected back at him. And so the ritual repeated. Night after night. Dynasty after dynasty. Body after body. Hundreds of women reduced to a routine, interchangeable, invisible. Stripped of age, voice, story. Their only value measured by how convincingly they could pretend not to exist. Sometimes, the emperor didn't even speak. A finger pointed across the courtyard. A name murmured by a eunuch. That was all it took to pull a girl from her thoughts and into the machinery of a god's imagined eternity. Some girls were used once. Others many times. None were remembered for who they were, only for what they allowed. What started as myth hardened into custom. What began as superstition became policy. And no one stopped to ask if any of it was true. Because the emperor was aging. And when gods age, someone must be sacrificed to feed the illusion of their youth. This wasn't intimacy. It was obedience measured in breathless silence. And if you think this deserves to be remembered, subscribe. If not, at least confess why in the comments. We dare you. It should have been a miracle. To carry the emperor's child was supposed to be the closest a concubine could get to divine purpose. A sacred elevation. The moment her body, long owned by someone else, finally bore something of value. But in the Forbidden City, pregnancy was not a blessing. It was a gamble. And the stakes were life, death, or something worse. The moment her belly began to swell, the whispers began. Not of congratulations, but of calculations. What month was the child conceived? What omens surrounded the night she was summoned? What did the astrologers say about the alignment of the stars, the cycle of the moon, the energy of the season? A son born under auspicious signs might one day rule. A son born under the wrong ones might be erased before his first cry. And if the emperor had too many sons, born too close together, under competing signs? The tension rippled through the palace like poison in tea. A favored concubine who became pregnant suddenly found herself surrounded, not with comfort, but with eyes. Eunuchs. Senior consorts. Spies posing as handmaidens. Every step she took, every morsel she ate, every glance she gave was watched and recorded. Because a child meant power. And power, in this place, was rarely left to chance. Some concubines were poisoned before they gave birth, subtly, slowly, through tinctures meant to balance the womb, or teas said to ease the spirit. The truth was known only after the blood had already come, after the silence in the belly could no longer be denied. Others gave birth in locked rooms. Alone. Unconscious. Only to wake and be told the child had died in the night. No body was shown. No explanation offered. Then there were the infants born healthy, only to vanish. If a son was born under a cursed sign, or if the emperor feared his rise might threaten another line of succession, the solution was simple and final. A wet cloth. A swift hand. And silence. The mothers were never told. Or if they were, it was spoken in riddles. He was not destined, they'd say. The heavens called him early. What they meant was, he wasn't wanted. But the danger did not end with birth. A concubine who bore a son and survived the delivery often rose in status, sometimes even above empresses. Her name was spoken in court. Her meals were richer. Her robes darker, heavier, more adorned. But with that elevation came jealousy sharp enough to cut through walls. Other women who had waited years, who had served loyally, who had been chosen again and again without reward, they watched her. Some plotted. Others whispered to eunuchs, sowing doubts in the emperor's mind. Rumors of unfaithfulness. Whispers of sorcery. Accusations so carefully shaped they might as well have been truth. A single rumor could undo her completely. Some concubines, knowing the danger, chose not to carry at all. They drank secret brews passed from one desperate hand to another. Potions that burned the womb from within. Elixirs that silenced the body before the palace could silence the child. They chose barrenness. To survive. Others were given those same potions without their knowledge. A cup of tea. A spoon of soup. A sweetened wine at night. And slowly, without ever realizing, the possibility of motherhood slipped away. Because in the palace, a woman was not allowed to choose. Not when she was a girl. Not when she was touched. Not even when she carried life. The body did not belong to her. Not when it was empty. Not when it was full. Not even when it was bleeding. This was not a world of mothers. It was a factory of heirs. And if the machine broke, even for a moment, it was discarded. If the thought of it lingers in your throat, if you find yourself grieving for children who never got names, for mothers who never got to mourn, subscribe. So their stories don't disappear the way they did. And if you don't believe this matters, if you think this is just the past, say it out loud in the comments. Let someone, anyone, read it back to you. They were the quietest men in the empire, because they were never allowed to become men at all. The eunuchs of the imperial court were not born to serve. They were made to. Cut. Drained. Sealed in silence before their voices could even deepen. It began in the villages, among the poorest families. A son too weak to till the fields. Too many mouths to feed. A desperate father. A traveling agent whispering promises of palace work, of honor, of silver coins for the family left behind. The child never knew what awaited him. He was led to a courtyard. Told to kneel. Given a bitter tea that burned the throat and numbed the soul. Then held down, by hands too strong and too practiced. The blade was not always sharp. The pain, indescribable. Sometimes they took the testes. Sometimes the entire organ. There were no physicians. No sterilization. No mercy. Only a cold basin to catch the blood. Only a prayer that he wouldn't die before it stopped. Many did. They were buried in unmarked graves. Others survived, but not unchanged. Their voices rose higher than the women they guarded. Their bodies grew long and strange. Some never stopped bleeding. Some never slept through a night again. And yet, they became the lifeblood of the palace. Only eunuchs were allowed to pass between the emperor and his harem. Only they could touch the concubines without offending the sacred order of the court. They became guards, bathers, messengers, confessors. They carried secrets in their silence. Secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Some hated what had been done to them. Others learned to wield it. Over time, a few climbed the ranks, serving closely under the emperor, manipulating court factions, even controlling the very flow of imperial power. One eunuch might oversee thousands of concubines, managing their schedules, rationing their food, deciding who lived near light, and who did not. But many remained nameless. In the coldest halls, they stood as still as statues, opening doors for the men who had taken their futures. Escorting trembling girls to their first night of duty. Washing blood from linens they did not stain. Delivering death orders with bowed heads and dry eyes. And yet, some participated. Some enforced the very rituals that had once broken them. Forced the baths. Conducted the inspections. Stripped the girls. Beat them for disobedience. Whispered to the emperor about which concubines should be favored, or forgotten. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. They had been hollowed out. So they filled themselves with what little power they could find. But when they died, there were no descendants to remember them. No sons. No daughters. No names passed down. Their bodies were sometimes buried with the very genitals removed from them in childhood, preserved in jars, sewn into their robes, returned like some grotesque apology. They gave up everything for a life that was not theirs. To serve a man they would never be. To guard women they could never love. To keep traditions they were never allowed to question. This was not devotion. This was not destiny. This was a structure built on mutilation. And maintained by silence. They lost everything just to open doors for emperors. If that cost feels like too much, subscribe. Not for pity. Not for shame. But because someone should still remember them. And if you're not ready to subscribe, tell us in the comments what would make you care. Because silence, that's what made all this possible. Night fell like a second skin in the Forbidden City, silk-draped and soundless. But even in that stillness, no one truly rested. Especially not the women. For the emperor, sleep was sacred. Protected. Uninterrupted. For the concubines, it was a privilege they had to earn. Each night, dozens of women were placed on rotation. Selected not by health, not by age, not by need, but by a schedule designed to serve desire that might never arrive. They were called to sit, to wait, to be ready, just in case the emperor's appetite stirred before dawn. And while he slept undisturbed in a chamber large enough to swallow their quarters whole, the concubines sat in silence, still, perfumed, dressed in a thin shimmer of moonlight and ritual. They were not allowed to slouch. Not allowed to close their eyes. To yawn was disrespect. To tremble was weakness. To show fatigue was to insult the very God they had been chosen to serve. So they sat. Some upright for hours, knees locked beneath ceremonial robes, heads gently tilted in feigned serenity while their bodies screamed for rest. Servants walked behind them in regular intervals, not to comfort, but to observe. To report. To punish. And the punishment for drifting into sleep? A demotion. A loss of food rations. Isolation. A beating. Sometimes, they were not punished at all. Just removed from rotation. Quietly. Permanently. Like a candle snuffed before it finished burning. To sleep was human. And in the inner court, humanity was a threat. The younger girls bore it better, their limbs still pliant, their backs not yet hunched by years of kneeling. But even they learned quickly, this wasn't a test of beauty. It was a test of obedience under exhaustion. And as they aged, even that obedience began to fail. Those who could no longer sit still for hours, whose hands shook or whose eyelids drooped despite their will, were moved. Slowly. Invisibly. To the rear chambers. The place where names stopped being spoken. Where the laughter of youth was replaced by coughs, and prayers, and long stretches of nothing. No visitors. No summons. No return. They had once been favorites. Once been chosen. Now they sat in the farthest halls of the palace, where even the walls forgot them. And still, each night, the cycle continued. The emperor might not summon anyone for weeks. But they still had to wait. Just in case he opened his eyes. Just in case his thoughts turned toward hunger. It was not about desire. It was about control. Sleep deprivation was not a side effect of the system. It was the system. A ritual of dominance wrapped in formality. A way to say, even your rest belongs to me. Even your dreams. And over time, the girls stopped dreaming altogether. Because dreaming required hope. And hope required sleep. And sleep was no longer theirs. If you've ever closed your eyes in safety, in warmth, without fear. Understand this, that comfort was not universal. It was denied to generations of women who were told their very exhaustion was disrespect. Subscribe, if only to say that their sleeplessness was not in vain. And if you still don't see why this matters, write it in the comments. Let the world see what silence looks like when it tries to speak. Affection was not forbidden in the Forbidden City. It was impossible. Love, real, uncalculated, unsanctioned, was not just discouraged. It was punished with death. Because inside those walls, every breath a woman took was meant to belong to the emperor. Every glance, every whisper, every heartbeat. Even those he never asked for. To love another man, even in silence, was to steal from the throne. To offer your smile to a eunuch or a guard was to commit theft against divinity. The walls were tall, but the eyes within them were taller. And there was always someone watching. Guards who paused too long near a chamber door. Eunuchs whose gaze lingered on a concubine's hands. Women whose laughter was a note too free, too bright, too alive. Even dreams were dangerous. If a concubine spoke in her sleep, murmuring a name not sanctioned by the emperor's court, if she wept into her pillow for a family left behind, for a boy she once knew, if she painted poems or folded paper cranes for someone other than her divine master, it was betrayal. Not in action. Not in touch. But in thought. And thought alone could lead to execution. Some were strangled in private, silk cords drawn tight so the death would be clean, elegant, quiet. Others were made examples. There were courtyards designed for such lessons. Stone platforms. Iron rings. Hanging ropes prepared not in secret, but with ceremony. A concubine accused of loving wrongly would be bound, displayed before the others. Her crime read aloud, not with evidence, but with certainty. She dared to feel. She dared to desire. She dared to belong to someone else. And then she was removed from history. Her name stripped from the scrolls. Her chamber reassigned. Her robes burned. Her friends scattered to opposite corners of the court, warned not to speak of her again. But they remembered. They always remembered. In the small ways, refusing to wear her favorite colors, whispering her name into folded letters buried in gardens, lighting incense not to honor her crime, but to mourn her sentence. Because deep inside, every woman in the palace knew it could be her. That love was not a gift. It was a trap. A feeling they were born with, only to spend their lives hiding. And yet, it happened anyway. A glance in the dark. A shared smile at the edge of a prayer. A hand brushed too long while passing a scroll. It wasn't rebellion. It was human. And in that place, humanity was punishable. They called it loyalty. They called it purity. But it was fear. Fear wrapped in silk. Fear carved into law. And when fear becomes the law, love becomes the executioner's excuse. If fear was the law, and love the crime, then who do we blame? Subscribe, so we can keep asking these questions. Because someone has to. And if you choose not to, be brave enough to say why. History is watching. So are they. The halls are quiet now. The silk has yellowed. The perfume has faded. The gates of the forbidden city stand open to tourists, but the silence, that remains untouched. What they show you are the thrones. The calligraphy. The gold dragons dancing across painted ceilings. They tell you about emperors and battles, about wisdom and conquests. But they do not take you to the tombs without names. Because some stories are not carved in stone. They are buried beneath it. The women who served, suffered, and disappeared within those palace walls were given no monuments. No mausoleums. Some were laid in shallow plots under false names. Others, cremated without ritual, their ashes scattered without direction. There are no children to tend their graves. No family trees to carry their memory forward. Just dust, over dust. Forgotten not by accident, but by design. And the eunuchs? Their end was no gentler. They died with no descendants, no legacy. Some were buried with the body parts cut from them in childhood, preserved in jars, as if returning what was taken could make it right in death. But death was not a cleansing. It was another kind of silence. Meanwhile, the emperor's name remains, etched in gold, remembered in textbooks, worshipped in museums. His legacy preserved in ink and stone. His voice survives in stories. His portrait is restored with care, displayed with reverence. But not hers. Not theirs. Their voices were softer. So history chose not to listen. Their pain was private. So the world chose not to look. Their lives were small, but only because someone decided they should be. This is the cost of forgetting. This is what happens when cruelty is hidden behind silk curtains and tradition. When suffering is edited out of legacy. When obedience becomes invisible. And still, their bones rest beneath the palaces. Still, their silence echoes through the painted corridors. Still, their names press against the corners of history like fingerprints on glass, almost gone, but not quite. Because you are here. And you heard them. History is often written in blood. But only if someone remembers to read it. So read it. Say their names. Subscribe, and refuse to let them disappear again. Because silence was the crime. And you, just by remembering, might be the only justice they'll ever know. You were never meant to hear these stories. They were stitched shut by dynasties, erased by scholars, softened by time. The women, vanished into corridors with no exits. The eunuchs, reduced to whispers. The rituals, sanitized or forgotten. But you heard them. You walked through the smoke. You stood beneath the dim lanterns. You listened to the silence, and for once, you didn't look away. And now that you know, what will you do with it? Because this was only one palace. One empire. One chapter. There are others. Walls just as high. Rules just as cruel. Women buried beneath titles. Desire weaponized. Bodies claimed in the name of kings and gods. Next, we open the veil on the forbidden brides of the pharaohs. Girls bound to tombs before they were old enough to speak their fate aloud. A different empire. A different ritual. The same hunger for control dressed in gold and sacred words. At Tale of History, we don't just tell stories. We open graves that were never meant to be touched. We trace the dust back to the wound. We speak the names that history tried to swallow. Subscribe, not because it helps us, but because they were never allowed to be heard. And if you still won't, leave your reason in the comments. One day, someone might read it aloud in your name. And wonder what silence you were trying to keep.